a pleasure to see you. I'm, for those people I don't know, I'm Ruth Mandel, director here at the Eagleton Institute of Politics, and it's actually, for those of you who remember Noel Coward, it's going to be my pleasure to introduce the introducer. I'm not going to say much about Marc Mappen because the introducer is going to do that, but I am going to say that I did tell Marc a little while ago that I don't want this to go to his head, that there was some kind of miscommunication and that people thought there was a rock star here tonight.
They missed the
It is, for those of us who work at the Eagleton Institute of Politics and spend a fair amount of time attracting some very interesting, accomplished, devoted, dedicated public servants to this podium to speak, and then spend a fair amount of time trying to, find the audience for them. Look at this. There must be something about corruption. Now, there are several jokes about corruption I am going to avoid. But a colleague of mine told me one of them this afternoon, and I came downstairs a few minutes ago and said to him, you know how I don't remember punchlines? I don't even remember the lead into this one. I don't remember what it's about, but tell me this again. And he said, no, Marc is going to use it. So I'm not using it. You have to use it, Marc, okay? This lecture is sponsored by the Rutgers Ethics Initiative, which is a joint project of the Eagleton Institute of Politics and the Prudential Business Ethics Center at the business school, the Rutgers University Business School, mostly in Newark, although the business school spreads itself out. It's also in New Brunswick, as I have learned lately. This project is something that we started a few months ago with support from the university in something that it calls its Excellence Program. And each year they ask all of us on all three campuses to compete with each other for a very small amount of money. And we put proposals in and we have good ideas and we all compete, and then some of us are lucky enough to get a little bit of support to get something started. And Eagleton and the Prudential Business Ethics Center won one of these awards last year, and that has allowed us to begin a series of conversations and meetings and programs. We have some rather grand ideas. We have a very small budget, so we've begun a series, and we hope we'll be able to build on what we've begun this year. The partners in this project, I'm representing Eagleton, the director of the Prudential Business Ethics Center, and our co-conspirator is Professor Ed Hartman, and you will meet him shortly because he's the real introducer. The person who is coordinating everything that we're doing is my colleague here at Eagleton, Don Linke, who's standing in the back of the room, and he's the one with the jokes, but he's given them to us to tell. As part of the initiative, we've sponsored a variety of activities, including here at Eagleton, we conduct, I think many of you, probably the most well-known project of this institute in New Jersey is the Star Ledger Eagleton Rutgers poll, the statewide public opinion poll. And last year, in the primary season before the gubernatorial race, we conducted a poll in which we asked the citizens of New Jersey to name their top priority issues. And of course, everyone expected that to be education, taxes, car insurance, the usual issues that show up. But in fact, the issue of corruption came out right at the top of the list for our citizens. As a result of that, we held a focus group and brought a number of New Jersey residents together here at Eagleton and talked with them for a couple of hours, average citizens, about corruption in New Jersey. And what we heard was rather negative assessments of their perceptions of the level of corruption in government and politics in the state. But it was a kind of schizophrenic thing because at the same time, they didn't want to leave New Jersey. They thought it was a great place to live and work. So on the one hand, they thought it was reeking with corruption. On the other hand, they thought it was the best place to live and work. And I don't know what that teaches us, but it is something that we took away from that session. and something that we're not quite sure what to do with. We followed up that focus group with a roundtable discussion among prominent leaders in New Jersey. That discussion included former Supreme Court Justice Daniel O'Hearn, who is currently the co-counsel to Acting Governor Cody on ethics reform and the co-author of an excellent report to the governor on reform in the state government. Also in that round table, another participant was Richard DiCleone, who is chair of the Century Foundation and now heading the transition team for Governor-elect Corzine. That was a very spirited and wide-ranging discussion, and the opinion leaders who participated in it seemed to be a bit more positive than the citizens of New Jersey, and they suggested that perhaps some of our problems aren't that unusual compared with other states. We had been having a debate here at Eagleton about whether if we somehow got the funding to do a project that allowed us to measure the perceptions of the 50 states where New Jersey would come out in that competition. And those of us who have done a lot of work with the Center for American Women and Politics here at the Institute know that we come out in the country in the bottom 10 usually. We've just moved up, but in the bottom 10 for the numbers of women in our legislature. But we come out right at the top for the issue of corruption. Or at least that's the perception. That may, the two, there is a connection there, maybe. That's the perception. We don't know what the reality is. There are many people who wish to compete for the title on the corruption issue. Louisiana, we had someone here from Pennsylvania yesterday who was saying Pennsylvania wins no matter how many Sopranos we watch on television. Pennsylvania's way out ahead of us. So we still don't know. Yesterday in this room we did hold a conference that was organized by Ingrid Reed, who heads the Eagleton, New Jersey project, and it also included Justice O'Hearn and his co-counsel on the governor's ethics reform team, Professor Paula Francesi, who is at Seton Hall's law school. And then a couple of people from other states, Ohio and Pennsylvania, who head ethics commissions in their states, talking about what they're doing about regulating ethics issues, investigating, and what kinds of training programs they're offering. So I'm telling you all this because I want you to be aware that while tonight is Marc Mappen night, it is part of a larger project that we're engaged in. We're not quite sure yet where it's going, but we know that this is a very important issue. It's a big issue, and it's also a big issue here at Rutgers. In fact, next week we are going to hold another program, this time a faculty colloquium focusing on ethics, character education, and related areas at Rutgers. And we hope that discussion is going to contribute to the current debate at the university about what a core curriculum should be or what should be included in core curriculum, because we think that here, we think that ethics is at least as important as aesthetics, which I have a lot of respect for, but I'd like to see both of them get equal weight in whatever we go ahead with in the core curriculum for this university. In any case, that just gives you some sense of some of the range of activities and participants and subjects that are engaging us as we look at the question of ethics in the Rutgers Ethics Initiative. Tonight, we are really happy to welcome Marc Mappen to this podium. Many of you know about him because you've purchased the Encyclopedia of New Jersey. But I'm going to leave the details to my colleague and co-conspirator. I'm happy to introduce, or to bring to the podium, the introducer, Professor Ed Hartman, an old friend, a partner in this project. Ed is professor of philosophy at the business school at Rutgers and is very familiar with the issue of corruption and ethics, and he will tell you about himself and about Marc Mappen. Ed. I know you're a professor of business.
Thank you, Ruth. I've never enjoyed working with anybody at Rutgers more than I have with Ruth and Don Lenke and Ingrid Reed, except when I co-taught Douglas Honors Program's course with my wife. And even if that's true, but even if it weren't, I certainly would say it. Tonight we're happy to welcome Dr. Marc Mappen, the biggest of big shots in the field of New Jersey history, who is co-editor-in-chief of, hang on a second, yes, the Encyclopedia of New Jersey. I've been working out all week so that I can do this. Published by Rutgers University Press, director Marley Wasserman, who's here tonight, I believe, protecting her investment. Well, the most comprehensive profile ever published by a long shot of the people and events and organizations that have contributed to making New Jersey what it is today, for better or for worse. The encyclopedia, the New York Times called it 6.5 pounds of pure Jerseyana. Marcus has authored 2 books, Jerseyana, The Underside of New Jersey History, and Murder and Spies, Lovers and Lies, Settling the Great Controversies of American History. He's gone through them and definitively solved them so that, for example, now we know that it was the Japanese who bombed Pearl Harbor right now. He's also the editor of another book, Witches and Historians, How to Tell the Difference. And he's written for the Los Angeles Times, Rutgers Magazine, New Jersey Heritage, New York Times, and The History Teacher, among other things. Marc used to be the Associate Dean of University College here at Rutgers, and he's got his Ph.D. in American History from the very fine History Department at Rutgers. He speaks often at New Jersey historical societies, libraries, clubs, civic groups, weddings, bar mitzvahs, and has also appeared on the History Channel, National Public Radio, and provided commentary on the radio series New Jersey Times. His awards include the History Issues Convention Maureen Ogden Award and the Society of Cincinnati Award, and tonight he caps it all off by being a speaker for the Rutgers Ethics Initiative. You notice I haven't said what Marc is doing right now for a living. He's asked me not to, but I can give you some hints. First, many of the people who gave Marc a hard time when he was at Rutgers aren't around anymore. He's started referring to himself as Marc the Undertaker Mappen, and using phrases like leave the gun, bring the cannolis, and so on, so draw your own conclusions. We're calling this talk a brief history of New Jersey corruption because a full treatment would probably take us through next Tuesday. So we look forward to Marc's views and your views, too, on questions like, is New Jersey different in its attitudes and tolerance of corruption in public life? Are there factors in our history, our composition, democratic composition, new government structure, business and political culture that have tended to encourage unethical conduct by political figures? There will be a quiz afterwards, as you can tell. I'm sure that one of the reasons so many of us are here tonight is that we know Marc Mappen and regard him as a dear friend. We also know that Marc is probably the funniest man in the world. No pressure. So it is my extreme pleasure to welcome Marc Mappen.
Thank you, Ed, and thank you, Ruth. When I got here and saw Ruth and Don Lincoln, there was some talk about what a big crowd there was, and it was suggested maybe because some people misunderstood this and thought it was a how-to. But, and maybe it is, I don't know. But on the other hand, a lot of the people I am going to talk about were caught, so maybe actually this is a how-not-to. Anyway, while working on this speech about corruption in New Jersey, I came to appreciate how Thucydides must have felt when he sat down to write his history of the Peloponnesian War, or how Leo Tolstoy, his War and Peace. In other words, there's a lot of material to cover. I know that there is a debate about whether a pervasive culture of corruption exists in New Jersey as compared to other states, or whether we are just better at exposing corruption and rooting it out. Well, there was one man who had no doubt whatsoever about the answer. His name was Lincoln Steffens, and he was one of the muckraking journalists of the Progressive era early in the 20th century. In 1905, 100 years ago, his article entitled New Jersey, a Traitor State, appeared in McClure's magazine. To say that this article was critical of our state is an understatement. Steffens was furious. He said, "New Jersey is selling out the rest of us." He said the state shows plainer than any other state or city how we are all betraying one another. He spoke of the stench of the vice graft and of a state whose citizenship was mean, narrow, and local. Said Steffens, "New Jersey deserves all the punishment we can give her. I'd like to see the citizens of this selfish state pickle in the corruption of Hudson County and Essex, of Camden and Passaic and Middlesex and Ocean." But on second thought, he said, that was unfair. I know my feeling about punishing Jersey is wrong. It is too Jersey-like. To Steffens, in other words, New Jersey had been corrupt throughout its history. Steffens, incidentally, was the man who, years later, paid a visit to the Soviet Union and to Lenin, and he said, "I have seen the future, and it works." Well, clearly that was one of the great bonehead remarks of all time. But while Steffens might have been wrong about Russia, was he right about New Jersey? To answer that question, let me take you on a tour of corruption in the Garden State, a sort of stroll down venality lane, starting in the colonial era and concluding towards the end of the 20th century. I want to say at the outset, I love New Jersey. I wouldn't want to live anywhere else. But there are some aspects of our state, our history, that are less than pretty. So forgive me if what follows seems to be a collection of, can you top this, horror stories, a sort of a freak show of dishonesty. Here goes. Let's start with our origins as a British colony. Some colonies, like Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, were established as holy commonwealths, dedicated to fulfilling God's will on earth. But New Jersey was born as a sort of real estate speculation. The colony was seriously established in 1664 as a proprietary, meaning that ownership of the land and control of the government was vested in a board of shareholders that sought to make money by selling land to the settlers. This led to bitter disputes between the proprietors and the non-proprietors over property titles, the payment of rents, and the right to govern. And to make matters more complicated, early on in its history, the single proprietary of New Jersey had been divided into two colonies, East and West Jersey. This was an impossible situation, and in the start of the 18th century, the British Crown decided to bring the two colonies, East and West Jersey, back into a single colony and to place control of the government under direct royal rule. To carry out this mission, in 1703, Queen Anne sent over a distant cousin, Edward Hyde, who bore the royal title of Lord Cornbury, to be the first royal governor. Alas, Cornbury turned out not to be the best man for the job, sort of like Michael Brown at FEMA, if you know what I mean. After he arrived from England, he reportedly accepted bribes from all parties. He persecuted the Quakers. He set aside great portions of land for his cronies. He is also said, from time to time, to have fannied about dressed up like a woman. A loathing of Cornbury became one factor that united both proprietors and anti-proprietors. Cornbury, who the colonists described as, quote, a detestable maggot, unquote, was ultimately recalled to England. Now, I have to point out that Patricia Bonomi, a professor of history at NYU, has written a book arguing that Cornbury has been unfairly treated, that the charges against him, from accepting bribes to cross-dressing, were second-hand slanders cooked up by his enemies. Maybe so, but I think that the charges have a ring of truth. No subsequent royal governor ever faced such a level of accusations. The evidence against Cornbury survives in the form of affidavits. One is from Dr. John Johnston, a member of the proprietary group, who explained how he went to see Cornbury early on in his lordship's term, how he offered a 100-pound bribe, how Cornbury demurred, saying he could not accept it, how Johnston left the money anyway, how he subsequently delivered more. Johnston went on to describe how Cornbury referred to the bribe as a loan, although neither man ever expected it to be repaid. It all sounds like the transcripts of tapes made by a wired FBI informant meeting with a political boss today. So in sum, the first known bribe in the history of New Jersey dates back to the first days in office of the first royal governor in the first years of the 18th century. We're talking about a long history here. Now let's leap ahead a century or so to the new republic established by the American Revolution and the Constitution. There were great hopes expressed by the revolutionary generation that the new nation would be a republic of virtue, living up to the noble example of the Roman Republic. One of those with the highest hopes was New Jersey founding father William Patterson. So it's a bit ironic that one of Patterson's pet projects turned out to be an early example of corruption. In 1791, Secretary of State Alexander Hamilton and his associates formed the Society for the Establishment of Useful Manufactures, with the goal of establishing a high-tech industrial city in New Jersey, employing the water power of the Great Falls of the Passaic River. The town was named Patterson, after the then governor of the state, who worked to get the legislature to grant the society a charter. Tens of thousands of dollars were raised in stock sales, but early on the project nearly collapsed on the rocks of human greed. The first director, a speculator named William Duer, had played fast and loose with the accounts of the society, placing the funds into bad investments, awarding himself a $50,000 loan, and pocketing $10,000. Duer wound up in debtor's prison. Equally troubling for those with hopes for the virtuous republic was the rise of parties and factions. A major episode in that new reality was a special election held in Essex County in 1807 to decide whether Newark or Elizabethtown would be the location of a new county courthouse, because the city that won the courthouse would become the county seat, which would bring prestige and business. Mass rallies were held on both sides on the eve of the election. Men from Elizabeth were assaulted in Newark, and according to accounts of the election, some voters came back over and over again to cast ballots. The New Jersey Journal, sound familiar? The New Jersey Journal lamented that, quote, a more wicked and corrupt scene was never exhibited in this state or in the United States. Well, now, if you look at these scandals, you have to admit that the scandal at the Society for the Encouragement of Useful Manufactures was really something involving New York City speculators. And the Essex County election was really a local affair. The truly classic, large-scale sort of corruption involving businesses and government had to wait for the 1830s, when a new industry arose in New Jersey, an industry that required major capitalization and that actively sought monopoly status and shelter from taxation. I am talking about the railroads. With the development of the steam engine in England as it spread to America, prominent New Jerseyans lobbied for creation of a railroad. Our state, as a transportation corridor between New York and Philadelphia, was the perfect location. And in 1830, the state legislature enthusiastically chartered the Camden and Amboy Railroad. The railroad promised to bring enormous revenue to New Jersey at a minimal cost to its citizens. In exchange for being granted a monopoly and protection from taxation, the railroad provided shares of stock to the state with the guarantee that the stock would realize at least $30,000 annually. For many years, the railroad lived up to its promise, covering virtually all of the state's expenses and making property tax unnecessary. How did the railroad amass all this money? Well, it charged higher rates for passengers who were traveling through the state, much more than for passengers whose travel originated inside and ended in New Jersey. And it's been observed that this habit of gouging outsiders has been a feature of other New Jersey tax schemes right down to the present day. But the relationship between the Camden and Amboy and the state of New Jersey turned out to be a Faustian bargain. The corporation's management knew full well that to protect their favored status, they had to exercise control over the legislative process. And in so doing, they shaped the political life of the state for decades to come. Let me now introduce you to William E. Sackett, 1848 to 1926, a journalist who chronicled hanky-panky and corruption in New Jersey in his wonderful two-volume work, Modern Battles of Trenton. It's a great book. I encourage you to read it. Looking back at the start of the Camden and Amboy, Sackett described how this giant enterprise exercised its power. His prose may be purple, but it is accurate. Here is what he said. In its early alliance with the legislature of the state, and the popular enthusiasm with which its coming had been hailed, and the state's habit of conceding to it for the purpose of increasing her own prosperity, whatever privilege or franchise or exemption or even monopoly it asked, made it arrogant and aggressive, and it soon came to be recognized as the power behind the throne in the control of all the affairs of the Commonwealth. It went into counties, picked out its own nominees for places in the Senate and Assembly, secured their election to the seats for which they stood. The ambitious politician, hopeful for public honors, had first to make his peace with this rapidly growing monopoly and to secure its favor and consent to his canvass. Such a thing as a candidate announcing his opposition to the railroad company and surviving the election was almost unheard of in state politics. The railroad selected the governors of the state, picked out the men who were to go to Congress, named the United States senators. So absolute was the control of all departments of the state government that the state itself came to be known as the state of Camden and Amboy. There never was a more complete master anywhere of the decisions of a state than was this monster monopoly of the affairs of New Jersey. Its enterprise reached out in 1,000 different directions, and there came a time when the state that had taken the corporations to its bosom as a child began to fear it as a master. So said William Sackett. Now, if you want to read an account of what it was like to travel on the Camden and Amboy through New Jersey, let me recommend Charles Dickens, the English novelist's account in his 1842 book, American Notes, about a trip he took on the Camden and Amboy from New York to Philadelphia. And he was mostly struck by the enthusiasm with which his fellow passengers spit out the window. So this brings us to the period after the Civil War. The stage was set for this great age of corruption, the so-called Gilded Age. This was a time when corruption was a national phenomenon, the age of robber barons, big city machines like Boss Tweed of New York, scandals like the Credit Mobilier. You can't blame all of this on New Jersey, but you have to admit we were an enthusiastic player. One episode of corruption stands out in its awfulness. It seems that in 1874, one Alexander Hamilton served as the Republican treasurer of Jersey City. Now, I hasten to add that this Alexander Hamilton had no relationship whatsoever to the founding father of the same name. Anyhow, in January 1874, this Alexander Hamilton absconded with $86,000 in cash and bonds, almost the entire treasury of Jersey City. He left nothing behind except his wife and 3 children. It was said that this treachery was done out of infatuation with an attractive actress. Jersey City offered a reward for Hamilton's arrest, and a detective set out to find him. Well, the fleeing Hamilton made his way to Texas in the Wild West. He got a corrupt policeman in Corpus Christi to smuggle him over the border into Mexico, where he was turned over to a shady character named Pedro, but not before the policeman and his companions shook Hamilton down for $7,500. Pedro turned him over to another outlaw named Happy Jack, who in turn delivered him to a bandit named Cortinas in Matamoros. More of his money was taken at every stage, and when he was finally broke, the bandits threw him on a boat to Brazil. This is true, incidentally. The saga ended a few months later when the destitute and disheveled Hamilton returned to Jersey City, where he turned himself in and was sentenced to 3 years at hard labor in the state penitentiary. Of course, Hamilton, again, was just one corrupt man at the local level. For the classic multi-layered corruption of the Civil War, we have to turn to State House corruption. There were powerful interests abroad in the land that were willing to buy influence, like the liquor lobby, the racetracks, and of course the railroads. The railroads in this era continued to evolve. In 1871, the old Camden and Amboy line was taken over by the Pennsylvania Railroad. And after a ferocious battle in the legislature, the line's monopoly ended, and competing railroads were brought into the state. It took another battle to impose taxes on railroad property. In that era, the governorship was firmly in the hands of the Democratic Party. The Democrats elected every state chief executive in New Jersey from 1869 to 1896, and usually held the assembly. But the governors in that era, under the Constitution of 1844, were very weak. They only served 3-year terms, could not succeed themselves, had very weak veto power. For that reason, the real power rested with the so-called State House ring, the leader of which was Henry C. Kelsey, who served as New Jersey's Secretary of State for a quarter of a century. Now, I said that the State House was the scene of corruption. Matter of fact, the building itself for much of the late 19th century was a prime example of that corruption, a sort of pyramid of plunder, if you will. There was, in fact, a bar, an open bar with marble, with mirrors, with mahogany, open for business just off the rotunda in the quarters of Barney Ford. Barney Ford was the superintendent of the State House and a lieutenant in the State House ring. By every account, Barney was a popular fellow with legislators, governors, lawyers, judges, and local officials, and reputedly, he was a figure in the State House ring and a go-between in bribery and looting. So a friendly saloon with free liquor was part of his hospitality. And the rest of the State House was spared no expense. It was later found by a Senate investigating committee that the costs of the Capitol building had gone from $19,000 in 1888 to $71,000 6 years later, that a construction project that should have cost $7,500 wound up costing $27,000, that a flagpole and flag on the front of the State House cost $1,350. This was in an era when the average workman made about $700 a year. Expense accounts were padded with $3 lunches, which were regarded as outrageously extravagant. Printing contracts were enormously inflated. Furniture and carpets purchased for the State House were taken away for private use. What was happening, clearly, was that favored contractors were making a fortune by overcharging, and the State House ring was benefiting by kickbacks. The investigating committee was hampered by the destruction of evidence. For example, one State House contractor named Mike Hurley, he testified, he said he couldn't really provide records because the mice had devoured those sections of his ledgers, only those sections that contained state accounts, which led to sarcastic references to Hurley's discriminating mice. When plans got underway in the 1980s in our own era to restore the State House, the architectural historians who were working on that project were surprised to find that very few construction records had survived from the late 19th century. They should really not have been surprised. Well, government in Trenton in this era went from bad to Wirtz, specifically George T. Wirtz, who was elected governor in 1892. Now, besides the governorship, the Democrats in that year captured both houses of the legislature. And here's what William Sackett, as cynical as ever, had to say. Almost every Democrat who floated to a seat in either house of the legislature in 1893 represented a ring, or one of the disreputable bosses, or a job, or had been tempted to his candidacy by the hope of illegitimate gain. Thus, everything that was venal or corrupt or offensive in the management of public affairs was largely reflected in the legislature. And the lawless groundlings who had succeeded in securing their ascendance in state and county and city found license for fresh excess. One such excess was to blatantly legalize gambling at the state's racetrack, something public opinion was firmly against, but which, of course, the racetrack owners supported, and several racetrack employees were members of the legislature. For this action, the Assembly and the Senate were derisively described as the jockey legislature. Governor Wirtz vetoed the bill legalizing gambling, but it was passed over his veto. Well, there was such public outrage that the next election brought in a Republican majority to both houses. But astonishingly, the old Democratic Senate refused to seat the newly elected Republican majority. Governor Wirtz caved into party pressure and lamely recognized the Democratic rebels, leaving state government crippled until the state Supreme Court ruled against the rump Senate. The public was revolted by this behavior. The election that followed brought in a Republican governor. No Democrat was elected governor for another 15 years. Another hallmark of corruption in that period was an election in Hudson County in 1889 that made that Elizabethtown election of 1807 look like a church outing. The election records indicated that in some precincts in Hudson County, voters had conveniently gone to the polls in perfect alphabetical order, with the B's following the A's and so on. In other precincts, the voters cast their ballots in exactly the order in which they had registered weeks before. Evidently, the electorate of Hudson County consisted of anal retentives with a compulsion for order. They also had what they called joker ballots. This was a way of stuffing the ballot box with counterfeit ballots. So you had to put your ballot in the ballot box, but you could tuck these counterfeit ballots inside. And so to stuff the ballot box. And these counterfeits were really crude. Some of these ballots misspelled the word Hoboken. And surprise, many of the voters later tracked down by investigators turned out to be dead. Right. Here's what Sackett had to say. Fortunate indeed it was for the weak-nerved men and the hysterical women of the county that they knew nothing of a ghostly invasion of the county, indicated by the poll lists, till it was all over, and the risen cadavers of a past voting era had slunk back in their shrouds to their eternal slumbers again. It reminds me, of course, that line by Brendan Byrne that after he died, he wanted to be buried in Hudson County so he could remain active in politics. Well, more than 60 Hudson County Democratic officials were found guilty of election fraud, but they served only a few months for their crimes, and the man behind the scandal, Robert Little Bob Davis, sheriff and political boss of Hudson County, got off scot-free. I think that the election of 1898, the 1893 jockey legislature, marked the absolute worst level of corruption in our state. Now, I realize that what I'm saying sort of lays all this at the feet of the Democrats, but you have to trust me that in this era, the GOP itself was cheerfully corrupt. Thanks to the fact that the Senate was elected by county, the more rural counties in New Jersey were usually able to elect a majority to the state Senate. The Republican Senate had its own boss in the person of General William J. Sewell of Camden County, described as the iron-willed Bismarck of the GOP. Besides being a senator, Sewell was a high-ranking official in the Pennsylvania Railroad and commanded an army of lobbyists and lawyers to protect the line's interests. In this period, Republicans fought to minimize the Irish Catholic Democratic influence in Hudson County by gerrymandering and establishing commissions to run the major departments of government in Jersey City, a practice called Ripper legislation that was finally stopped by an amendment to the state constitution in 1875. So in sum, the late 19th century was a period in which corruption and bare-knuckle politics flourished. But new winds were blowing in New Jersey, and they brought the progressive impulse represented on the national scene by reformers like Teddy Roosevelt. The ranks of progressives in New Jersey included reformers within both the Democratic and Republican parties, organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the National Consumer League, the New Jersey Federation of Women's Clubs, agitated for reform, and like their brothers and sisters in other states, New Jersey progressives saw as their enemy the old forces of corruption. One episode, I think, exemplifies the concerns of the progressives. In 1903, New Jersey's power elite went on trial in Newark. It seems that in February of that year, a horrific accident occurred when a trolley filled with kids on their way to school was struck by a locomotive at a grade crossing. 9 trolley passengers, most of them kids, were killed, 30 were injured. Well, the Essex County Grand Jury concluded that the operator of the trolley line, the North Jersey Street Railway Company, was to blame. The 4 top officers of the firm and the 7 members of the executive committee of the board of directors were indicted for manslaughter. 4 days into the trial, however, the judge dismissed the case on the grounds that there had been no criminal negligence. Well, this case became a progressive cause célèbre because it meshed so much with the progressive dislike of the trolley car monopoly. In Newark and other municipalities, trolley companies had managed to obtain perpetual franchises and enormous tax exemptions. A leading progressive charged that the Newark case had been fixed, that bribes had been offered to quash the indictment at the grand jury level. And when that failed, the judge and the prosecutor colluded to dismiss the case and thereby protect their friends. And indeed, the principal figures in this case were part of the clubby elite of business leaders, politicians, and lawyers that spanned Newark and Trenton. The trolley company board represented the most powerful corporations in the state. Among the defendants were E.C. Young, president of the North Jersey Street Railway Company, A.J. Cassatt, president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, Leslie Ward, vice president of the Prudential Insurance Company. Sorry, Ed. Okay. These men had equally powerful friends who invested in the trolley company, who attended the trial to show their support. Men like U.S. Senator John F. Dryden, the founder of the Prudential, Thomas McCarter, president of the Public Service Corporation, former Attorney General of New Jersey. The lawyer for the trolley company was none other than good old George T. Wirtz, the former governor who presided over the jockey legislature. The county prosecutor was Chandler Riker, an early investor in trolley stock. And the judge was the Chief Justice of the New Jersey Supreme Court, William S. Gamir, who had once been a lawyer for the Pennsylvania Railroad. I want to say that Gamir had an important connection to the history of Rutgers. Anybody know what Gamere had to do with Rutgers? It was very brief. It happened on a November afternoon in 1869. Well, he was the captain of the Princeton team that played Rutgers in the first intercollegiate football game in 1869. Well, there was much public scorn at the verdict. Chandler Riker dropped out of the race for the Republican gubernatorial nomination. And as for Gamere, 3 years later, it was widely touted in Washington that he was going to be nominated by President Taft to fill a vacancy on the U.S. Supreme Court. The progressives who were opposed to Gamere's nomination published the old trolley allegations, and no more was heard of Gamere's candidacy. Let me mention a second progressive-era scandal. Remember Lincoln Steffens' 1905 muckraking article, New Jersey, a traitor state? What Steffens was focusing his anger on were New Jersey's incorporation laws. It seems that in the late 19th century, a canny young New Jersey lawyer, James B. Dill, with the cooperation of leading politicians and businessmen, established the Corporation Trust Company of New Jersey. For a fee, the company would assist businesses to incorporate in the state, even furnishing New Jersey residents to serve on boards of directors to satisfy the law. To attract the trusts, New Jersey passed laws shielding corporations from regulation and legalizing giant holding companies. Among the trusts that took advantage of the friendly climate by incorporating here in New Jersey were John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company and James B. Duke's American Tobacco Company. And the scheme produced enormous revenue for New Jersey. It was reminiscent of the great days of the Camden and Amboy Railroad, when money from outsiders provided enough money to keep taxes on residents artificially low. It seemed like a win-win idea. The trusts could free themselves from bothersome interference from other states, and the taxes paid by these corporations swelled the New Jersey treasury. But the only losers, as Steffens pointed out, were the people of the United States, who were helpless before the monopolistic practices of these corporations. In his article, Steffens provided a dramatic metaphor for what New Jersey was up to. The law required businesses incorporated in New Jersey to have meetings here from time to time. So hotels on the Jersey side of the Delaware and Hudson had a big business in hosting these meetings. Businessmen would travel over from New York and Philadelphia. They'd hold their meeting in the morning. They'd go home in the afternoon. Steffens said that some of the hotels catered to prostitutes in the evening, completing his picture of New Jersey as the red light district for American business. In subsequent articles, Steffens returned to New Jersey to profile courageous leaders of the progressive movement who were battling corruption. The state's progressive movement ultimately came to be personified by one man. Who that? Who was that? Woodrow Wilson, the president of Princeton University, who in 1910 was elected governor of New Jersey on the Democratic ticket. Wilson did not spend much time here. He took office in mid-January 1911 and was elected president of the United States less than 2 years later. But what a 2 years that was. By cajoling, pushing, shoving, he got the legislature of New Jersey to pass bills reforming the election process, workmen's compensation, public utilities, city government, public education, labor unions. One of his promises in the election was to tame the corporations. And once in office, he pushed through 7 bills, the so-called Seven Sisters, aimed at taking New Jersey out of the incorporation business. The Seven Sisters put strict controls on New Jersey corporations. Any violations were punishable by depriving the corporation of its charter and prosecuting its directors. And Wilson also took on the political bosses. Back then, as I'm sure you know, United States senators were elected by the legislature, not the people. Well, the boss of Essex County, the Democratic boss who had helped Wilson get elected governor, expected that his reward for this would be a Senate seat in Washington. But Wilson refused, and instead, after a furious speaking campaign around the state, got Democrats in the state legislature to name as senator an individual who had won a non-binding primary. It was this battle that truly established Wilson, gave him a national reputation that put him in the White House. Now, it's possible to poke holes in Wilson's record, to complain that he dashed off to the White House on a wave of popular acclaim, leaving his successors in Trenton to face failed reforms and broken promises. And in fact, many of his reforms were repealed or diluted. And after New Jersey got out of the incorporation business, Delaware just stepped in and picked up the trade. But without question, Wilson was the most dynamic and energetic governor in the history of our state, a man who accomplished more in a briefer period of time than just about any governor of any state anywhere. The professor transformed sleepy backwater New Jersey into the center of national attention for its progressive reforms. Alas, it didn't last. Now, I talked about the corruption that seemed to bloom in New Jersey after the American Revolution and after the Civil War, and I think you can argue that the same occurred in World War I or after World War I. Certainly, national prohibition, which went into effect in 1920, was part of the post-war picture. New Jersey was a resolutely wet state. One candidate for governor had run on the slogan that he was as wet as the Atlantic Ocean, and he won. Ira Reeves, the director of the Prohibition Bureau office in New Jersey, complained that corruption was everywhere. He found that bootleggers were frequently protected by law enforcement authorities. The police chief of Trenton threatened to arrest the Prohibition Squad for carrying concealed weapons. In Essex County, the police showed up to protect a still. Reeves found that his agents had been uniformly bribed, and he found that when he got a tip, when somebody called up the office to complain about speakeasies and the distilleries, the tips were really coming from rival bootleggers who were trying to put the competition out of business. Reeves even had a promise not to raid the state legislator's annual dinner in Atlantic City. Well, Prohibition produced an entire generation of gangsters in New Jersey, like Abner Longy Zwillman of Newark, who got his start in the crime business as a liquor delivery boy and ultimately became rich from loan sharking, crooked unions, bookmaking, and casinos. Bribing government officials and law enforcement officials was part of his normal business expenses. Other New Jersey gangsters spawned in this era were Willie Moretti and Joe Newsboy Moriarty. And I think it's a very interesting reflection on New Jersey's ethnic diversity that Swillman, Moretti, and Moriarty were, respectively, Jewish, Italian, and Irish. Well, Atlantic City was wide open in this era. It was a center for prostitution, illegal gambling, bootlegging, all presided over by Enoch Nucky Johnson, who crossed the line between politics and crime. Johnson was the county treasurer and Republican boss of Atlantic County, one of the leaders of the Jersey GOP between the wars. He thrived on protection money from Atlantic City's brothels, saloons, gambling operations. And in 1929, Johnson arranged for a national convention of leading mobsters in Atlantic City. To Atlantic City came such notaries as Longy Zwillman, Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, Dutch Schultz, Frank Nitti. Scholars of the underworld say this was an important moment in the development of organized crime. And this was covered quite openly in the newspapers. And there were articles about Al Capone sitting in a rolling chair on the boardwalk in Atlantic City. This was also the era of Frank I Am the Law Haig, who served as mayor of Jersey City from 1917 to 1947. And I know that Tom Fleming, the historian, gave a talk in this series about Haig. I don't really want to repeat it, except to say that Haig was a prime mover in New Jersey political corruption. By controlling the vote in Hudson County, he got to determine who became governor and who those governors appointed to judgeships, thereby shielding himself from prosecution. He was also personally corrupt, able to afford silk underwear and a Florida home from the kickbacks he received. Tom Fleming tells a great story about a sort of a dim-witted minion who worked for Boss Haig. And periodically, Boss Haig would give him a suitcase. And he had instructions to take the suitcase into New York, and he would go to banks and brokerage houses, and he would deliver the suitcase. Somebody would come out to meet him, would take the suitcase into the back room, and then after a while would come out, give him the suitcase back. So this guy went back and he asked Boss Haig, what's in the suitcase? And Haig said, money, you stupid bastard. Well, the worst governor in the period between the wars was Harold Hartman, a Republican who served from 1935 to 1938. At the time of his death, it came out that he had been on the take throughout his political career. He embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from government operations and from a South Amboy bank for which he served as an officer. At the time of his death, he was being blackmailed for $150,000. Well, I've been speaking about the periods of corruption that follow after wars, but I must say that pattern does not follow after World War II. Quite the contrary. I would say the period from the late 1940s through basically the end of the century was an era when major reforms were put in place to fight corruption. In 1947, the state took a major step by adopting a new constitution, the Constitution of 1947, which created a modern framework of government, a coordinated judicial system, and a powerful governor. All of this was adopted over the objections of Frank Haig and other bosses who liked the system just the way it was. Measures to prevent corruption followed under the new Constitution. A state commission of investigation was established in 1968. In 1970, the state adopted sweeping legislation that established the Division of Criminal Justice, making the Attorney General the chief law enforcement officer of the state. This unified integration of law enforcement really set a national example. In 1973, the Election Law Enforcement Commission was established to monitor the financing of all elections in the state. In the same year, the Executive Commission on Ethical Standards was created. The Casino Control Commission was created in 1977. Regulations were adopted to to ensure that open biddings on government contracts were conducted fairly. And also in those years, the Office of the U.S. Attorney, aided by the FBI, came to play a much more aggressive role in cracking down on corruption. And New Jersey, in this period, has been fortunate to have a number of governors under the 1947 Constitution who encouraged reform, like the great Alfred Driscoll, who came out of the reform wing of the Republican Party, and it was Driscoll who pushed through the Constitution of 1947. Richard J. Hughes, who had been an assistant U.S. attorney and later a Superior Court judge. Brendan Byrne, Essex County prosecutor, and like Hughes, a judge in the Superior Court. And the U.S. attorneys appointed for New Jersey have on the whole been effective. Frederick Lacy and Herbert Stern in the 1970s stand out. Incidentally, one U.S. attorney in New Jersey, Samuel Alito, who served in that office from 1987 to 1990, is now a candidate for the Supreme Court. Well, certainly there have been quibbles about the effectiveness of these measures and these officials, but they clearly represent an attempt on the part of state and federal government to stamp out corruption. My impression is that no other state has established so many agencies and their regulations aimed at corruption. These measures continue today, and as you may or may not know, on January 1st, 2006, New Jersey will officially ban the pernicious practice of pay-to-play at every level of government. And pay-to-play, in case you don't know, is the practice of awarding government contracts to individuals and firms that have contributed to political campaigns. Well, there's some skepticism about this, if this will really work, but let's see. Now, I am not so stupid as to believe that corruption has been wiped out as a result. We still have corruption and plenty of it, but in my opinion, it is being identified and prosecuted more than was usually the case in the past. Let's take a look at some of the more newsworthy prosecutions of the period. Here's one. In exploring the causes of the Newark riots in 1967, a state commission heard allegations of widespread corruption in the administration of Mayor Hugh Adonisio. An investigation led by the U.S. Attorney's Office found the city government was indeed corrupt, massively so. It was the old story. To get a contract, firms had to pay 10% of the contract as kickbacks. The city council, the corporation council, the Department of Public Works, all were involved, with enforcement provided by mobsters by the Boiardo crime family. At the top was Huey Adonisio himself, who was reported to have told one of the contractors, who later became an informant, there's no money in being a congressman, but you can make $1 million as mayor of Newark. Another illuminating quote was attributed to Anthony Tony Boy Boiardo, speaking to a reluctant contractor. You pay your 10% or I'll break both your legs. Well, Adonisio and his key associates were tried and convicted, and Huey got 10 years in jail and a $25,000 fine. And there were other successful prosecutions. I looked for an example of a New Jersey politician who was elected to office while in prison, like Mayor Curley of Boston, but I couldn't find any, but there was one New Jerseyan who came close. In May 1982, state senator and Union City Mayor William Musto was reelected mayor, a day after being sentenced to prison for taking school construction kickbacks. This may be the origin of the joke that New Jersey is the place where politicians are investigated, indicted, convicted, and reelected. Let me provide a personal perspective on this. I spent part of my childhood growing up in Woodbridge, New Jersey, and I was a history nerd even then. I had great respect for Washington and Lincoln, for the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and my respect for American government, I think, rubbed off in my attitude about the town mayor, Walter Zerpolo, who I would see at school events and town events. And it was when I was in college, some years later, that I was disillusioned to read that former Mayor Zerpolo had been indicted for accepting a $110,000 bribe to let the Colonial Pipeline Company run an oil pipeline and build a tank farm in Woodbridge while he was in office. I think everyone who grows up in New Jersey can recite a similar episode of disillusion. And it reminds me of the line from Lily Tomlin, no matter how cynical I get, I can never keep up. Well, Let me, in speaking of this post-war period, trot out David Friedland, maybe New Jersey's most colorful rogue legislator. Friedland was a state senator who faked his own death in a boating accident in order to escape prosecution for a union pension fund kickback scheme. He was arrested in the Islamic Republic of the Maldive Islands, and while in jail, he asked his girlfriend to obtain a local woman he could marry, and thereby becoming a convert to Islam in order to beat extradition. Well, his attempt failed. He was returned to New Jersey in 1987, where he pleaded guilty to a racketeering charge. He served 9.5 years in federal prison, and he's when last heard of is living in Florida. And I think William Sackett would have loved the story of this guy. Okay. I began by asking whether the muckraker Lincoln Steffens was correct when he stated that New Jersey had a deep-seated culture of corruption. And I will chicken out here and let you come to your own conclusion on this question. But it is certainly significant that candidates for public office and for governor in recent years always rank corruption as one of the major problems facing in New Jersey. And so has a thumping majority of the state's citizens in every public opinion poll asked about this issue. In January of this year, the Star-Ledger ran an editorial listing every corruption-related event that had happened over the previous 12 months, every raid, indictment, and sentencing. And they came up with an average of one every 4 days, which is really quite remarkable. And it reminds me of another joke from the year of the 1970s recession. Business is so bad, the mafias had to lay off 6 judges in New Jersey. Well, and yet, it is possible to believe that New Jersey has a culture of corruption without accepting the idea that we are the most corrupt in the nation. And here I want to refer back to what Ruth said about really the need to establish some kind of index of all this. But there has been one. A study of public corruption was put together by the Corporate Crime Reporter in 2004. Using federal corruption convictions from 1992 to 2003, the study calculated a state-by-state rate per 100,000 residents. So using this measure, the most corrupt state in the nation, according to this index, was, guess? Where? I know. Well, Louisiana, Bill Schluter here is close, was actually Mississippi. So, and a matter of fact, New Jersey did not even make the top 10. We came in 16th, better than New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, just to name some neighboring states. But admittedly, the Corporate Crime Reporter Index is seriously flawed, I would say. It's based actually on the number of convictions, federal convictions, which really may be as much of an indicator of the zeal of prosecutors as it is of corruption. But at this point, until Ruth does her study, it's just about the only one that we have available. And we should also not take too much comfort in the index. Even if we are 16th, that still puts us roughly in the top third of states ranked by corruption. So let us inquire into what accounts for the corruption that is here, that might make us more prone than the states at the bottom of the scale, like the three with the lowest rate, New Hampshire, Oregon, and Nebraska. You know, what might make us more corrupt? Well, 2 Harvard faculty members, Edward Glacier and Raven E. Sachs, took the Corporate Crime Reporter scale and then crunched the numbers to see what factors about a state seem to correlate with the corruption rankings. One of the conclusions they reached was that the more ethnic heterogeneity in a state, the greater the level of corruption. Well, this is really suggestive for New Jersey. Ever since the colonial era, New Jersey has had one of the largest and most diverse immigrant populations in the nation. And today, the foreign-born population of New Jersey is 18%, which is almost exactly what it was 100 years ago in the golden age of Ellis Island. Classically, I would say, doing a little pop sociology, the traditional ladders to success are closed off to newly arrived immigrant groups so that illegal avenues become an option. Recall the Prohibition-era trio of Zwilman, Moretti, and Moriarty. Now, another factor in corruption, and the Harvard professors don't mention this, but I think any student of New Jersey is aware of this, is what the late Alan Karcher called our multiple municipal madness. New Jersey has 566 municipalities, more per square mile than any other state in the nation. And we are a home rule state where those municipalities have a remarkable degree of authority over zoning and development. And don't forget our 21 counties and our 611 school districts, each making decisions about hiring and contracts. In fact, I think there are now more than 611 school districts with the charter schools. Well, an article in the Star-Ledger stated the problem succinctly. quote, New Jersey's tradition of home rule, which places tremendous power in the hands of thousands of local officials, creates a perfect petri dish for corruption. Land use approvals worth billions of dollars fall to these officials, who often accept campaign contributions from developers who stand to benefit from their cooperation. This fierce localism can be seen far back in our history, back to the time of Cornbury, when New Jersey was divided into two colonies and when New Jersey towns openly revolted against the authority of the proprietors. So in summary, you could say that there are two factors stretching back into our state's history that might help to explain corruption in New Jersey: the diversity of our population and our devotion to home rule in our municipalities. However, it seems to me that the first, that diversity is really a tremendously valuable aspect of our society. And the second is a political third rail that is going to be with us for a long time. So in closing, let me summon up a fantasy. When I was working on this, I began to develop this picture in my head that all of these grifters, embezzlers, shakedown artists, and crooked Pauls from New Jersey history somehow have a place in the afterlife. And then after a hard day in purgatory, I imagine that they gather in a bar run by Barney Ford, like he did in the old days of the State House, with the liquor provided by Longy Zwillman. And I see at the bar Alexander Hamilton, that absconding treasurer of Jersey City, and Huey Adonisio of Newark, and Frank Hague, and Harold Hoffman, and William Dorr, all talking shop. And here comes Lord Cornbury, who's put on a nice little cocktail dress for the occasion. They're waiting to greet David Friedland when he passes on, and who knows how many others might follow him. Because the one thing we can be sure of from the history of New Jersey is that there will be others, many others. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, any questions, observations? No? I did such a great job. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm curious as to how you're defining corruption.
Okay.
And if I can just say it, the easy stuff is the graph, the personal embezzlement, someone who takes a kickback, understood. But I think your words are the pernicious pay-to-play system, which is actually legal. I mean, it's not an illegal thing, and pay-to-play, while it doesn't pass a smell test, is nonetheless not a it's not like the politician who will vote for the contract and therefore gets a new car, as much as it is part of the system of how campaigns are run. So can you talk a little bit about when you were doing your research and preparing for this, how did you understand corruption, and did you have a specific definition?
Well, I did, and I thought somebody might ask about it, so here it is. I define corruption to mean lack of integrity or honesty, especially susceptibility to bribery, the use of a position of trust for dishonest gain. Okay, so the use of a position of trust for dishonest gain. And actually, you're right, some of these practices are perfectly legal. And I think I also played a little fast and loose with this definition because I dragged in people like Longy Zwillman, gangsters, who I don't fit the corruption. I think in setting up this series, Ed Hartman spoke about that he wanted to focus on classic corruption between business and government, right? Well, anyway, so I guess the use of a position of trust for dishonest gain was what I used. Yes, ma'am.
My father-in-law was born in the 1860s or 70s and used to talk about the fact that you can't get things done for the benefit of the citizens without corruption. Because the reformers aren't interested in fixing anything. And all they want to do is save money. On the other hand, the ones who have their hands out are the ones who build the subways, are the ones who build bridges, and they're the ones who do all the other things that are good for the citizens of the area. Do you think that still applies?
Well, I don't know if it still applies, but I think it did in the past. And there are people who studied the, people like Boss Tweed of New York City and Frank Hague of Jersey City, and they brought immigrants into the political process. And they gave immigrants jobs. And I think Hague's problem was he basically gave them to the Irish, and the other ethnic groups in Jersey City were a little angered at that. But Boss Plunkett of the Tweed Ring in New York talked about honest graft, where you're actually helping people. And so I think you could say that, some of this corruption, I guess I have to be careful here, kind of the big city boss kind, did help ethnic groups, shunned groups, make it into respectable positions, into the middle class. Yeah.
Mark, I want to give you a offer I hope you won't refuse. I'm going to make you God. We're eliminating the state legislature and the governor, and you can, by mandate, do whatever you want to straighten out New Jersey. Would you like to tick off a few items, and just to the extent you'd like to?
I hesitate to tackle that one, but the one single magic bullet reform, I don't know if there really is anything like that. I think you're dealing with human nature here, and you have people who are selling something, their political influence, and you have people who are buying that influence, and that's a market. And I can't think of one miraculous reform that would change that.
I was looking for a bunch of them. For instance, you've ticked off a few. Pay to play is one of them.
Yeah.
Cartridge Municipal Madness Multiples is another. What else you got?
I don't think I'm giving you a good answer here. I think it's probably things like strengthening the Commission on Investigations, strengthening the Election Law Enforcement Commission, strengthening the Division of Criminal Justice, strengthening these agencies in state government to give them stronger enforcement authority. Of course, well, what happens if somebody in the enforcement is corrupt? I guess if I was God, I'd change human nature. That's what I'd do. Yeah, Mike?
Well, Ruth mentioned The Sopranos before, although you, a moment ago, excluded organized crime from what you mean by corruption, although on The Sopranos, eventually, some of the programs anyway, they are bribing legislators and that sort of thing. I mention all this because in any lecture trip I've made overseas in recent years, people love New Jersey, just in recent years. They love New Jersey for two reasons. They love it for Bruce Springsteen, and they love it for The Sopranos. They absolutely love New Jersey. They all want to come here. The BBC came over recently, did a whole program just loving New Jersey for these two reasons. So I guess what I want to ask you is are there some positive aspects of this corruption in terms of the affection which the world seems to feel for us these days, at least in New Jersey, not the rest of the United States?
Well, I think we could do without that affection for being corrupt. And it's, I think, corruption mingled with contempt. And I know a friend of mine was on vacation in Poland and was in Gdansk in a restaurant, and the guy there said, "Where are you from?" And she said, "I'm from New Jersey." And he said, "Oh, Sopranos." So yeah, you're right. That's what we are known about, and I don't think it's a good thing to be known about. And I wish we weren't, known for our corruption. And I think it's a way of looking down on New Jersey. We are, as you well know, New Jersey is the butt of jokes. And I love telling this, that there was a study done by a professor at a university in England to try to find the funniest joke in the world. And he put out something like 40,000 jokes on the internet. And he asked people to vote on what joke was the funniest. And and here is the joke that was judged the funniest in the world. And it's the two hunters in New Jersey are out in the woods. And one of them suddenly clutches his heart and falls down to the ground. And the first one is in a panic, and he gets on his cell phone, he dials 911, he says, "You got to help me, you got to help me, I think my friend is dead." And the operator says, "Now please be calm, I can help you. The first thing I want you to do is go over and make sure that he is dead." So she hears a silence on the cell phone, and then she hears, bang! And the guy gets back on the phone, and he says, "Okay, now what?" So I don't think it's good to be known for that. Okay. Any other? Yes, ma'am.
You left out one mayor from your list before. John Gregorio, the mayor of Linden, was convicted, I think in the 80s, I forget for what, and then Governor Kane pardoned him, and he's still very much a power broker today. I had the privilege of listening to Senator of Massachusetts Moore last night at a Change County government meeting in New Jersey. And they were able in Massachusetts to go from 14 counties to 5 in the past decade alone. And they did this through the will of the legislature. They had the big part in it. But he attributed the media attention on the problem and the will of the people on the problem. And I'd just like to know, in your opinion, do you think New Jersey today has the will of the people to actually stand up and say, we're sick of this, we can't take it anymore, and to actually force our elected officials to do something about it.
No. You're talking about the municipal madness issue, right? The fact that there were these, and I don't think so. And I think that the issue is that in these small towns, everybody knows has a brother-in-law who is the police chief, or an uncle who is on the school board, and I think it is just deep-seated. And again, it goes back right to the beginning of New Jersey. And indeed, if you look at the 1947 Constitution, it says in there that nothing in this Constitution shall be interpreted to diminish the authority of municipalities. It is so deep-seated, and Karcher, who wrote this book, New Jersey's Multiple Municipal Madness, he was a Speaker of the Assembly, but he said he couldn't write that book until after he left the legislature because he knew it would harm his political career. So I hope, wouldn't it be nice if someday that there was more, that I guess maybe some of the decision-making power was moved to a higher level, which is what presumably you would get if you abolish this municipal madness, but I don't think it's going to happen in our lifetime, in my opinion. Yes, sir.
In line with what you were just speaking about, I used to travel throughout New Jersey, and the biggest cry I would hear, and affirming Karcher's opinion, is home rule. And that is the basis of much corruption.
That's true. And much expense. I heard the statistic that Bergen County has more fire equipment than New York City. And I suspect it's probably true. There are dozens and dozens of municipalities in Bergen County. Each one needs its own hook and ladder, And I have what I call the Municipal Madness Challenge Cup. Let me explain this to you. I feel I have this sort of contest going about how you can drive through the most number of municipal boundaries, cross the most number of municipal boundaries in the shortest distance. And for a while, I thought I had the record with 5 municipalities, because if I started in New Brunswick, within 10 miles, you go from New Brunswick to Highland Park, from Highland Park to Edison, from Edison into Metuchen, from Metuchen, because it's a donut borough, into Edison, and then into Woodbridge. So that's a lot of municipalities in 10 miles. Somebody told me that they found a better one, I think, down in the Jersey Shore. If you drive up that highway on the Jersey Shore, you pass through more. But and again, we have more municipalities per square mile than any other state. And it does preserve some benefits, and it's nice to live in a town where your kids can walk to the high school and you know your neighbors, and yes, ma'am.
Do you think the high cost of campaigning is a factor in the corruption in the state, and if so, is there something that can be done about it?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, the question is does the high cost of political campaigning in New Jersey contribute to corruption? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if it would. In fact, you could argue the opposite, that if people who, let's say, who don't have a lot of money might be more corrupt, might more eagerly, be influenced by bribes. I'm sorry. What? Some other people have an opinion on that. Does the one problem? Let me just back up a bit. That New Jersey has, and I think it also contributes to corruption and to the high cost, is that there's no network affiliate in New Jersey. I think the only other state that's like that is Delaware. We don't have one of the major networks. We don't have a statewide newspaper. Woodrow Wilson used to complain that he lived in the only state where the residents of their state got news about their state from the out-of-state newspapers. And I think that increases tremendously the cost of a political campaign. Whether it contributes to corruption, I don't know. Yes, sir.
I'd just like to question a little bit the prevailing wisdom that New Jersey would be better off if we had fewer political subdivisions than we do now. And I should tell you that I'm a former mayor of New Jersey. But I wish someone would give me an example of one case where government became more efficient as it became larger.
Well, you raise a good point. And this is another one I can't answer. Does government get more efficient as it becomes? Is there more honesty, in other words, if the decision making is more concentrated? That's the theory of those who say that New Jersey's municipalities, that there's really a corruption tax that's created by having these multiple authorities where decision makers are at the local level that can be reached much easier. In fact, there was something in the paper yesterday about a government official in Old Bridge who got $7,500 in windows installed in his vacation home. Did you read about that? And he said it was given to him by a local contractor, and this guy was a building inspector, and the contractor gave him these windows. And the guy's defense was, oh yeah, he got the windows, but he forgot to ask the contractor for a bill. Come on. And evidently the contractor forgot to give him a bill. So this is a case of sweeping loss of memory in Old Bridge that we should be concerned about. Yeah, Bud?
I'll give you one example for what it's worth. Back about 10 years ago, Governor Whitman had this campaign for efficiency people to go out and study school boards and municipalities, and a lot of them did it. And the byproduct of that was a study done in 2 places in the state to try and gauge the effect and cost of this. I forgot where the other place was, but one of them was basically an attempt to reconstitute Westfield the way it had been in 1794 when it split off from Elizabeth, and it put back into present-day Westfield a lot of the peripheral towns that once had been part of it. And they put together the costs of the police and the fire department and all the politicians, well, not the politicians, they don't work very much up there, but the public works people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the population, they came up with a municipality of something like $100,000. They figured that if all this was squished together, then they compared, looked around for another municipality that was the same size in terms of population and expenditures, or a little bit less, and they found Edison. And they figured the cost of running Edison was a small percentage, maybe 1 or 2% less than the total cost of all these other reconstituted Westfields. And as I looked at it myself, I talked to people about this, I said, would you really like to save 2% and be like Edison? And you can guess what the uniform, now I have nothing against Edison, but it's not Westfield. And Westfield isn't Edison. I don't know anybody that would swap it. So I'm sort of with Alex, and I think we would rather have even our petite municipalities like Fanwood or Ship Bottom or places like that, rather than get reincorporated in the Edisons and Woodbridges, to say nothing of the Newarks of New Jersey.
Well, I think many people in New Jersey agree with you. Somebody else, you had your hand back up? You had your hand up there, sir?
Do you think that, I mean, there is in New Jersey a widespread perception by people in New Jersey that there's a lot of corruption. Whether or not that's true or not, we don't know. But do you think that that widespread perception of corruption allows us to fix things, or causes us to try to fix things, or does it have cynicism where people just say, well, that's just the way it is, and you've got to do your business in New Jersey and pay people off, and that's the way it works? Mm-hmm. Is it a good thing or a bad thing that people kind of feel that we're corrupt?
Well, I have to say, I am basically a broken-down historian. I'm not a policy wonk like Eagleton, so. But I would just think that actually it's a good thing. It's a good thing for people to be upset by corruption, and I think it encourages reform measures. And I think the problem back in the 1890s was that people just did not care. There was not a big reform movement. So I think the answer is yeah, that public outrage at the corruption hopefully produces results. Okay, one more?
I was just going to comment that many municipalities or school boards have consolidated, and I think there has been some positive effects. It's a specialty, I acknowledge, but there was one area that seems to have benefited from consolidation.
Yeah, there has been some, and I think the legislature even passed some laws to encourage, to have municipalities voluntarily merge, at least share services, and there was supposed to be some reward given back. And I think that's produced some small results, but it's a bigger problem. And they've tried incentives. Nobody's even thought of applying penalties, and I don't think they ever will. Okay? All right, thank you very much.
I just can't resist just a couple of very brief observations. It's not quite an observation, but I do want to point out that it's going to be a very interesting long moment, not just a moment, but the next few years, because we do have, as a result of this last election, we do have an incoming administration that at least has set out to say that ethics is a central issue, and I want to say that by acknowledging that in the room, I don't know who else is in the room, but I know one person, Zulema Farber, whom I see good friend of Eagleton sitting at the back of the room, has been appointed by Governor-elect Corzine to the new, is it called a task force? I keep referring to it as a task force on ethics. And this has been announced this week. And so, and as I mentioned to you before, the head of the transition team, Dick Leone, is someone who has been centrally concerned with this issue for many, many, many years and was a member of Governor Byrd's administration, is very proud about the role that ethics and the concern with ethics played in that administration. So that's on a serious note. On the other side, I want to say that it's really something, I don't know which discipline it is at the university, and it doesn't matter, but that we can sit in this room and listen to Marc Mappen's history of corruption in New Jersey, and on this day, as opposed to many other days when we have other kinds of speakers talking about issues in American politics, and there's more laughter in the room in the hour that you're describing this, it's like, what the heck else are we going to do? We might as well laugh about it. I find it, quite fascinating, and I don't know if other states laugh about their own foibles as much as we do, but I think at least we should feel good about the fact that that we have a sense of humor about it. And I can't resist making one final observation, since I've spent so much of my own professional life focusing on the subject of women's leadership in politics. He didn't mention one woman in that entire history. Thank you, Mark.